The image of a monk, cloistered in silence, devoted to scripture and prayer, is one of the strongest symbols of medieval spirituality. Within monasteries, it was believed that men withdrew from the temptations of the world to dedicate every moment of their lives to God. But behind the stone walls and the repetitive chanting of prayers, some hid secrets that were anything but sacred. This is the story of a man who took vows of purity, humility, and devotion. From early on, this monk was seen as different. His discipline impressed others, his voice in liturgy rang with fervor, and many believed he was destined to become an example of faith. Yet few recognized that his devotion did not flow solely from love of God, but from something far more unsettling, an insatiable need for control. The cloister, meant to be a place of silence and humility, became for him a stage where every gesture of piety doubled as an exercise of power. His vows of chastity and obedience did not serve as renunciations, but as instruments of manipulation. Abstinence, which should have symbolized purity, became a badge of pride and arrogance. Silence, meant to foster meditation, turned into a weapon of intimidation. Strict discipline, the essence of monastic life, became a spectacle of severity, intended to cultivate fear and respect among those around him. The monk understood early the power of appearance. He knew that in the eyes of the people, and even the higher clergy, the image of a fervent, holy man carried political and spiritual weight. Thus he crafted a near-theatrical routine of devotion. Long hours of public prayer, fasts flaunted as proofs of sanctity, and fiery sermons warning against sin. But while he preached renunciation, he nursed within himself an obsession, the conviction that he was purer, holier, and more worthy than everyone around him. This vanity disguised as faith became the fuel for his transformation. In the monastery's halls, he began to enforce strange practices, always justified in the name of spiritual discipline. He demanded that fellow monks submit to endless fasts, sleepless vigils, and penances that bordered on torture. His justification was simple. The more pain they endured, the closer they were to God. Few dared to challenge him, for the aura of sanctity he cultivated shielded him from suspicion. And so, beneath the veil of devotion, he hid a mind obsessed with shaping faith through suffering. This personal cult of pain soon extended beyond the monastery walls. To the faithful who sought his counsel, he preached a harsh, nearly impossible version of devotion. He demanded extreme sacrifices as proof of true faith and instilled in people a constant fear of damnation. Every error, no matter how small, was painted as a sign of deep corruption. Every doubt, however human, was described as the seed of eternal ruin. To the church authorities, he appeared as a model to be praised, a man who reinforced discipline in an age of moral decline. But inside the cloister, those who lived with him knew something was wrong. His gaze was not that of a compassionate guide, but of a man who relished watching others bow before his supposed sanctity. His vows of humility served only to disguise an ambition without limits, the ambition to be recognized as someone who had transcended humanity itself. And here is where faith turned into horror. What should have been a path of renunciation became a path of obsession. The vows that should have freed him from vanity trapped him in pride's web. Silence, prayer, and penance ceased to be spiritual practices and became tools of domination. This monk was no longer seeking God. He was seeking himself, a place where he could control, manipulate, and subjugate under the cloak of faith. The dark secret of this monk was not merely that he failed in his vows, but that he had corrupted them, transforming virtues into instruments of domination. And behind the monastery walls, a regime of fear began to take root, one that would soon extend beyond the cloister, revealing to the world that even in the heart of the purest faith, the seed of darkness can grow. Faith is built on ritual. For centuries, repetition of prayer, the rhythm of chants, and the order of ceremonies gave believers a sense of stability, a way to reach for the divine through structure. But in the hands of the monk who turned faith into horror, ritual became something twisted, something dangerous. What was meant to lift the spirit upward was dragged into the shadows, corrupted into madness. Within the cloister, rituals were already strict. Monks rose before dawn, prayed in unison, fasted on holy days, and lived by a rigid schedule that left little room for individuality. But this monk took those practices further, intensifying them until they became ordeals. He believed the body must be broken for the soul to be pure. He demanded vigils that stretched not for hours but for days, forcing others to kneel in cold chapels until their legs trembled and their lips cracked with exhaustion. Prayer was no longer a dialogue with God. It became a weapon to break human will. Whispers spread through the monastery of the strange ceremonies he orchestrated in secret. At night, while others slept, he would gather a select group of followers into dimly lit halls. There, by the light of flickering torches, chants echoed in tones so low and drawn out that they resembled incantations more than prayers. The air grew heavy with incense, not soothing, but suffocating. Each movement, each word, was designed to overwhelm the senses and blur the line between faith and delirium. These shadowed rituals often revolved around self-inflicted pain. He demanded flagellation, whips cutting into flesh, not as occasional penance, but as frequent practice. The sound of lashes striking skin became part of the nightly devotions, an eerie counterpoint to the chanting. The more blood that was spilled, the more purified the participants were told they had become. What had once been symbolic sacrifice became physical torment, a grotesque theater of suffering masquerading as holiness. The monk justified all of it with scripture, twisting verses into weapons. He spoke of discipline, of mortification of the flesh, of following Christ's suffering to the extreme. Yet behind his words lay something more disturbing, a fascination with control and submission. In these rituals, he did not merely seek piety, he sought domination. By forcing others into pain, by binding them with secrecy, he created a circle of followers bound less by faith than by fear and shared torment. The madness of these rituals went beyond physical suffering. Psychological manipulation was at the heart of his methods. He convinced his followers that the outside world was corrupt and that only within his rituals could salvation be found. Doubt was painted as sin. Refusal was heresy. Anyone who resisted was accused of weakness, cowardice, or demonic influence. Slowly, the rituals became not just acts of devotion, but tests of loyalty, where the cost of failure was exclusion, humiliation, or worse. Some accounts speak of ceremonies that blurred the boundary between the sacred and the profane. He inverted symbols, repurposed prayers, and layered mystery upon mystery, until even the participants no longer understood where faith ended and madness began. Were trapped in a spiral of fear and devotion, believing that through this horror, they were achieving something higher, something transcendent. Outside the monastery, rumors began to circulate. Pilgrims who visited claimed to hear strange sounds in the night, chants that chilled the blood, cries that did not sound like prayer but like agony. Local villagers whispered of shadows moving behind the monastery walls long after midnight, of lights that flickered where none should be. Fear began to surround the monastery itself, not as a place of holy refuge, but as a fortress of unsettling mystery. The monk thrived on these whispers. He understood that mystery fueled power. The more fearful people became of his secret rites, the more he seemed untouchable. His rituals were cloaked in the language of devotion, but their purpose was control. The outside world saw a holy man. Inside, those who lived with him knew they were participants in a descent into darkness. What made these rituals even more horrifying was their escalation. What began as long vigils turned into nights of deprivation, then into ordeals of blood and pain. The intensity increased with time, as though he were testing the limits of human endurance, not for God's sake but for his own. His obsession grew, and those under his influence were dragged deeper into his madness. To refuse meant ostracism, punishment, or even the accusation of betrayal. To comply meant surrendering to torment disguised as faith. The tragedy of these rituals was that they hollowed out the very essence of devotion. Prayer lost its meaning. Sacrifice lost its dignity. Faith itself became unrecognizable, twisted into an endless cycle of suffering. What had once been a path of hope was replaced by a labyrinth of despair, where the only exit was obedience to the monk's distorted vision. Looking back, these rituals are remembered not as acts of holiness, but as performances of terror. They were never about reaching God, but about feeding an obsession, reinforcing control, and cultivating fear. They stand as examples of how easily the sacred can be turned profane, and how a single man's madness can corrupt an entire community. In the end, the monk's rituals became infamous. They were whispered about long after his death, cited as proof of the dangers of fanaticism, and used as warnings of what happens when devotion loses its balance. For his followers, they were chains that bound them in terror. For the world beyond, they became symbols of faith transformed into horror. And so the story of these rituals reminds us that even in the silence of cloisters, where prayer is meant to rise like incense, darkness can take root. Rituals that should elevate the soul can just as easily drag it into madness. And when that happens, faith ceases to be salvation. It becomes the very prison of the spirit. Monasteries were meant to be sanctuaries of peace, silence, and reflection. Behind their thick stone walls, the world outside was supposed to fall away, leaving only prayer, discipline, and devotion. But under the influence of the monk who turned faith into horror, the cloister ceased to be a refuge. It became a prison of fear, a fortress not of holiness but of domination. His authority did not rest on wisdom or compassion, but on terror. A carefully constructed system that bent everyone within those walls to his will. From the moment new members entered the monastery, they felt the weight of his control. Silence was no longer a space for meditation, but a suffocating shroud of intimidation. Every movement was watched, every prayer scrutinized. He cultivated an atmosphere in which nothing could be trusted, not even the gaze of one's own brothers. The cloister echoed not with peace, but with dread, as if the very stones had absorbed the fear that hung over the halls. The monk's methods of control were subtle, yet relentless. He turned spiritual discipline into surveillance. Night prayers were lengthened until men collapsed in exhaustion, but failure to endure was treated as weakness or sin. Fasts were extended far beyond reason, forcing bodies to wither while spirits were accused of corruption if they complained. Sleep was rationed, food restricted, and every act of resistance was painted as rebellion against God himself. Through these extremes, he reshaped devotion into a cage, one in which faith was indistinguishable from suffering. But fear thrives not only in punishment but in uncertainty. The monk wielded unpredictability as a weapon. He might exalt a follower one day and humiliate him the next. A man who thought himself favored could find himself accused of impurity, dragged into harsh penances for imagined faults. This unpredictability created paranoia, breaking bonds of trust within the community. Brothers who once leaned on each other for support began to view one another with suspicion, unsure of who might be accused next or who might whisper accusations to gain favor. Public punishments were central to his rule. Within the cloister, they became spectacles of control. A monk who faltered in his duties might be forced to kneel for hours on cold stone, lashed in front of his brothers, or deprived of food until he wasted away. These punishments were not private corrections but staged performances, designed to remind everyone of the price of disobedience. Terror was not incidental. It was cultivated, displayed, and ritualized as part of life itself. Whispers began to spread among the monks, though none dared speak too loudly. Some said the cloister had become a place of shadows, where devotion was only the outer mask of a darker system. The monk's sermons, delivered with fiery passion, proclaimed purity and holiness. Yet his eyes burned not with compassion, but with something far more sinister: delight in submission, pleasure in fear. The cloister had ceased to be a brotherhood. It had become a hierarchy of domination, with him at the center as both judge and executioner. What made his control so terrifying was how thoroughly it blurred the line between religion and tyranny. Every punishment was framed as spiritual correction, every humiliation as penance, every act of cruelty as love for the soul. The monks trapped under his rule began to question their own sanity. Were they suffering for God? Or were they simply pawns in one man's obsession with power? Yet even as doubt gnawed at them, fear silenced their tongues. Resistance meant ruin. Silence meant survival. The cloister's fear extended beyond its walls. The people who visited began to sense the oppression that clung to the monastery. They reported monks with hollow eyes, gaunt faces, and trembling hands. Rumors spread of cries echoing at night, of punishments that resembled torture, of a community not sanctified, but haunted. Yet to the outside world, the monk still appeared as a pillar of devotion. His harshness was praised by some as holy zeal, his cruelty dismissed as discipline. Few dared to see the truth for what it was, a cloister transformed into a theater of horror. Even those closest to him were not safe. Loyalty was demanded but never rewarded. The more a follower submitted, the harsher the demands became. He pushed men past their limits, stripping away not only their strength but their identity. They ceased to be individuals. They became extensions of his authority, shadows bound by fear. This erasure of self was perhaps the cruelest act of all, for it turned devotion into slavery and brotherhood into isolation. In time, the monastery became infamous. Though cloaked in prayers and chants, it was ruled by whispers and terror. No one dared leave without permission, for departure was branded as betrayal. No one dared question the rituals, for doubt was punished as heresy. The walls that were meant to shield the world from sin instead trapped its inhabitants in despair. Looking back, historians struggle to separate fact from rumor, truth from legend. Yet the stories that endure paint a chilling portrait of a cloister where the sacred became a weapon, where faith was wielded like a whip, and where power was built not on love, but on fear. The monk's rule reminds us that institutions of faith are not immune to corruption, and that when devotion is twisted, even sanctuaries can become prisons. The cloister of fear he created stands as a warning. It shows how terror can be sanctified, how cruelty can be masked as holiness, and how men seeking peace can find themselves bound in chains of despair. The story of this monk is not only about his madness, but about the fragility of faith when it is used as a tool of control. In the end, the monastery he ruled was less a house of God than a kingdom of shadows. Its chants were cries, its rituals ordeals, its silence a weight heavier than iron. Those who lived within its walls carried scars, some visible, others buried deep in the soul. And though centuries have passed, the memory of that cloister endures as one of the darkest examples of how faith, when corrupted, can become indistinguishable from horror. Religion, at its core, promises redemption. The cloister was meant to be a sanctuary where men could purify their souls, cleanse their sins, and draw closer to the divine. But under the rule of the monk who twisted faith into horror, punishment became the very heart of devotion. Cruelty was rebranded as correction, torment reframed as love, and the lash of the whip became a sacrament. What should have been acts of compassion became rituals of control, sanctified in the name of God. The monk believed that pain was the only true path to purity. For him, suffering was not a consequence of sin, but its cure. He preached that only through torment could the soul be cleansed, only through blood could the heart be purified. His words turned scripture into justification, and his followers into victims. The line between devotion and abuse vanished, leaving behind a terrifying system where cruelty was celebrated as divine discipline. Punishments within his cloister were elaborate, ritualized, and public. When a brother failed in his duties, whether he nodded during prayers, faltered during fasting, or questioned an order, the monk ensured his correction was a spectacle. He would force the accused to kneel on cold stone floors for hours, whispering prayers until their voices broke. Others were lashed with whips before their brothers, each strike echoing through the hall like a sermon of pain. The punishment was not only for the guilty, it was a performance for the rest, a warning that no weakness, no doubt, would go unnoticed. But the cruelties escalated beyond simple penance. Hunger was his most common weapon. Fasts were stretched into ordeals, not days but weeks, leaving men skeletal and hollow-eyed. Bread was rationed, water withheld, and every pang of starvation was proclaimed a gift, a holy reminder of human frailty. Yet the monk himself remained robust, nourished by the fear he inspired and the control he exercised. His hypocrisy was hidden behind a veil of sanctity, while his followers withered under his command. Sleep, too, was a tool of torment. Nights were filled with endless vigils, prayers repeated until lips bled and voices cracked. Those who faltered were roused with blows or humiliations. Some were forced to stand through the night with arms raised in mock crucifixion, collapsing only to be dragged back to their feet. For the monk, exhaustion was proof of devotion, and collapse was evidence of sin. He built a theology of cruelty, one in which breaking the body was the only way to save the soul. Perhaps most chilling were the punishments designed to break the spirit. Silence was turned into isolation. A monk accused of weakness might be walled into a cell so narrow he could neither sit nor lie down, left alone for days with only darkness in his thoughts. Others were forced into coffins, told to contemplate their own deaths while sealed away in suffocating blackness. These acts were not corrections, but psychological torture, designed to erase individuality and enforce absolute submission. The monk's punishments were always cloaked in scripture. He cited the trials of saints, the suffering of martyrs, the crucifixion itself as proof that torment was holy. But his interpretation twisted these examples into excuses for cruelty. The suffering he inflicted was not redemptive. It was destructive. Yet to those under his control, questioning him meant questioning God. And so, silence prevailed, and cruelty became indistinguishable from devotion. Outside the monastery, his reputation remained untarnished. Reports of his severity were praised as zeal, his punishments as evidence of holiness. Pilgrims spoke of the discipline of his order with awe, mistaking fear for piety. The church authorities, desperate for examples of strict devotion, elevated his image as a model of spiritual rigor. The very acts of cruelty that broke bodies and minds were used to build his legacy as a saintly figure. But the truth whispered within the walls was far different. Monks trembled at the sound of his steps, fearing what new ordeal might await. Bonds of brotherhood disintegrated under suspicion and paranoia. Each man lived not as part of a community, but as a prisoner awaiting his turn. The cloister, intended as a haven of peace, had become a theater of torment. The cruelty did not end with his followers. The people who sought his counsel often found themselves trapped in his harsh vision of faith. He demanded extreme penances from those who confessed sins, sending men and women away with impossible burdens, fasting until fainting, walking barefoot across rough terrain, or kneeling for hours until their knees bled. For him, compassion was weakness, mercy a sin. He relished not in forgiving, but in watching others break beneath the weight of his demands. What makes his punishments so terrifying is not simply their brutality, but their justification. To him, cruelty was not cruelty at all, but divine necessity. He transformed torment into liturgy, suffering into sacrament, and horror into holiness. His victims were not merely punished, were taught to believe that their pain was sacred. This corruption of meaning ensured that his control was not only physical, but spiritual. He bound souls as tightly as bodies, convincing them that obedience to his cruelty was the same as obedience to God. Over time, the monastery itself became a legend of severity. Tales spread of monks whipped to death, of men starving in silence, of chambers where screams echoed through the night. Some dismissed these as exaggerations, yet those who lived within knew the truth. For them, every day was a negotiation between survival and despair. Every prayer a plea not for salvation but for reprieve from the next ordeal. In the end, the monks' punishments achieved the opposite of what they claimed. Instead of purifying souls, they corrupted faith. Instead of building devotion, they destroyed trust. The monastery ceased to be a place of refuge and became a monument to fear. His legacy was not one of sanctity but of horror, a reminder of how easily cruelty can disguise itself as holiness when cloaked in the language of God. The story of his punishments endures as a warning, shows how discipline can be twisted into domination, how zeal can become tyranny, and how faith can be weaponized to justify even the most monstrous acts. Behind every lash, every fast, every night of torment, there was not divine love, but human obsession. And when obsession wears the mask of faith, it becomes the most terrifying force of all. Power rarely exists without secrecy. And for the monk who twisted faith into horror, secrecy was not just a necessity. It was the very foundation of his rule. His reign inside the cloister did not survive on discipline alone. It endured because of a carefully woven web of silence, conspiracies, and betrayals that transformed the monastery into a place where truth itself became dangerous. To speak honestly was to invite ruin. To resist was to risk destruction. Fear ruled openly, but silence ruled deeper still. From the beginning, he understood that cruelty without secrecy could not last. The horrors he inflicted, the punishments, the twisted rituals, the manipulations, would have destroyed him if they had been fully exposed. But he created a system where victims became complicit, forced to guard the very secrets that enslaved them. Those who suffered were bound by shame, convinced that their pain was their fault, the result of hidden sins or divine punishment. Others were silenced by fear, certain that even a whisper of dissent would bring retribution. In this way, silence became the strongest chain of all. Betrayal, too, was a tool he wielded with precision. He turned brothers against one another, fostering an atmosphere where loyalty was fragile and suspicion constant. Whispers in the cloister could never be trusted because anyone could be an informant. He rewarded those who carried tales of doubt or disobedience, giving them temporary favor, only to discard them later. By pitting monk against monk, he ensured that unity was impossible. Brotherhood, the cornerstone of monastic life, crumbled under the weight of fear. In secret councils, he cultivated followers who shared his thirst for control. These were men who found power in aligning themselves with his cruelty, who repeated his words and defended his punishments as holy necessity. Together, they formed a circle of conspirators who upheld his reign. They whispered among themselves of loyalty, of purity, of defending the cloister from corruption. But in truth, their alliance was not built on faith, but on shared complicity and cruelty. Each man knew that betrayal of the leader would expose his own guilt, and so they bound themselves tighter in silence. Beyond the walls, the monk's reputation was carefully protected. Rumors of severity did emerge, but his allies knew how to manipulate them. To the church and the laity, they portrayed him as a holy reformer, a man too pure for ordinary souls to understand. His harshness was spun into zeal, his punishments reframed as evidence of devotion. Any whispers of cruelty were dismissed as slander from the weak or the sinful. Thus, the silence inside was mirrored by lies outside, a double shield that preserved his power. But conspiracies cannot endure without cracks, and cracks began to show. Some monks whispered in secret corners, their voices trembling as they spoke of their torment. Others dared to confide in outsiders, leaving behind fragments of testimony that hinted at the horrors within. These voices were fragile, often silenced by retribution, yet they sowed seeds of doubt. The more he tightened his grip, the more desperate men became to escape it. Betrayal, which he had used so effectively against others, began to turn against him. The most chilling aspect of his system was the way he weaponized confession itself. In a monastery, confession was sacred, a space for honesty, for unburdening the soul. But under his rule, confession became surveillance. He demanded complete openness, forcing men to reveal not only their sins, but their thoughts, their doubts, their fears. These confessions were not kept private. They were used against them, repeated in public humiliations, twisted into evidence of weakness or heresy. Confession ceased to be salvation. It became another tool of control, binding monks into silence out of terror that their own words would be turned into weapons. The web of silence extended far beyond the cloister walls. Local villagers who heard rumors often chose not to speak. Some feared the church, others feared the wrath of the monks' allies. And many simply could not believe that such horrors could exist in a place so sacred. Silence became complicity, whether intentional or not. The conspiracy grew, not because everyone agreed with it, but because too many were afraid to challenge it. In time, betrayal emerged from unexpected places. Those closest to him, the very men who once defended him, began to turn when his demands became unbearable. Some broke under guilt, others under fear of exposure. They whispered to outsiders, feeding fragments of truth that painted a grim picture of the monastery's reality. Each betrayal weakened the web of silence, though never enough to fully unravel it. The monk's control was vast, but it was also fragile, one revelation away from collapse. Yet even in betrayal, his power lingered. Those who spoke against him often vanished into obscurity, their words buried, their testimonies erased. Others retracted their accusations under pressure, leaving only confusion behind. The conspiracy around him was not a single thread but a labyrinth, where truth was swallowed, twisted, and hidden until no one could tell light from shadow. The legacy of his web of silence is perhaps the most terrifying of all. It reveals how cruelty thrives not only on the will of the oppressor, but on the complicity of the oppressed. Fear turns victims into guardians of their own chains. Conspiracies twist loyalty into betrayal, and silence ensures that horror endures. In his cloister, men prayed daily, but their prayers were whispered through lips sealed by terror. They sang hymns, but their voices trembled with fear. Every stone in those halls became saturated not with peace, but with secrets too heavy to bear. When history finally began to confront his legacy, it did so through fragments, testimonies half-whispered, documents stained with ambiguity, rumors preserved by those who dared to doubt. The full truth may never be known, buried under centuries of silence. But what survives is enough to reveal the pattern. Cruelty concealed by secrecy, domination maintained through betrayal, and horror preserved by the silence of those too broken to resist. In the end, his web of silence was his greatest weapon. Swords and whips could wound the body, but silence enslaved the soul. It outlasted his punishments, his rituals, even his life. Though the cloister eventually fell into ruin, the silence it once held still echoes as a warning that the most terrifying conspiracies are not those plotted in shadows, but those enforced through fear that teaches people to guard their own chains. Legacies are not always monuments of glory. Some are scars carved so deeply into history that centuries cannot erase them. The monk who twisted faith into horror left behind no miracles, no sanctuaries of peace, no communities uplifted by compassion. Instead, he left ruins of trust, shattered souls, and a legacy so drenched in fear that his name became synonymous with corruption and cruelty. His life stands as a warning, a grim reminder of what happens when devotion is warped into obsession and faith becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. After his death, the monastery he ruled lingered like a haunted shadow over the region. The walls, once intended to echo with prayer, were said to hold whispers of suffering, cries that never faded, and an atmosphere so oppressive that even pilgrims felt uneasy stepping through its gates. Some claimed the stones themselves seemed to remember the horrors they had witnessed, cold to the touch, heavy with silence, as if the building itself refused to let go of the fear that had once reigned within. The legacy of his cruelty spread through stories half-whispered by survivors and magnified by rumor, tales of endless punishments, of rituals that blurred the line between prayer and madness, of monks broken in body and spirit. These stories outlived him, shaping how generations remembered the cloister. His name became a symbol not of holiness, but of fanaticism unbound, of a man who cloaked tyranny in the garments of sanctity. And with every retelling, his legend grew darker, until he was remembered less as a monk than as a tyrant in robes. Historians who later attempted to untangle the truth found themselves lost in contradictions. Official records praised his zeal, elevating him as a model of strict devotion. Yet private testimonies, scraps of letters, and oral traditions painted a very different picture of a man who thrived on control, who turned confession into surveillance, and who sanctified cruelty under the guise of discipline. The truth lies somewhere between, but the weight of evidence tilts toward horror. The very duality of his legacy, saint to some, monster to others, ensures that he is remembered not for what he intended, but for the fear he left behind. His influence did not die with him. The structures he built of secrecy, of surveillance, of sanctified cruelty, outlasted his life. Other leaders adopted pieces of his methods, spreading the idea that fear was a tool of faith, that pain could purify, that silence could be enforced in God's name. In this way, his legacy metastasized, poisoning practices far beyond the walls of his cloister. He became a blueprint for fanaticism, showing how one man's obsession could reshape an entire institution. But his legacy was not just institutional. It lived on in the broken lives of those who endured his reign. Survivors carried scars, some on their bodies, many on their minds. They struggled to reconcile the faith they had once cherished with the cruelty they had endured in its name. For some, religion became a source of terror rather than solace, their prayers tainted by memories of pain. For others, silence became permanent, a wound so deep that they never spoke of what they had endured. This human toll is perhaps the most haunting aspect of his legacy. Faith, meant to heal, was turned into a weapon that left wounds no prayer could close. Legends grew around his memory, some painting him as a sorcerer who had struck pacts with darkness, others as a prophet whose zeal was too pure for ordinary men. But beneath the myths, one truth remains. He was a man who weaponized faith to satisfy his obsession with control. Whether seen as heretic or saint, his legacy cannot escape the fact that he turned a place of prayer into a theater of horror. Even centuries later, the ruins of his monastery became a site of uneasy fascination. Travelers wrote of its heavy silence, of local villagers who avoided it at night, of priests who refused to say mass within its walls. Some claimed the cloister was cursed, haunted not by spirits, but by memory itself. To walk its halls was to feel the weight of history pressing down, a reminder that what had once been cloaked in sanctity had rotted into cruelty. The horrific legacy of this monk reveals a universal truth. Power corrupts most completely when it hides behind the mask of virtue. His story shows how easily vows of purity can become tools of domination, how rituals meant to uplift can be twisted into ordeals of torment, and how communities built on trust can be dismantled by secrecy and betrayal. It is not only the tale of one man's madness, but of the vulnerability of faith itself when placed in human hands, too eager for control. In the end, his legacy is not preserved in relics or holy texts, but in warnings. He is remembered not as a beacon of devotion, but as a specter of what devotion can become when stripped of compassion. His story lingers because it exposes a terrifying possibility that within institutions built for peace, seeds of horror can take root, growing in silence until it is too late to resist. And perhaps that is why his name endures. He stands as a cautionary figure, a reminder that faith without mercy becomes fanaticism, that discipline without compassion becomes tyranny, and that silence without truth becomes complicity. His cloister, once intended as a refuge, became a prison. His rituals, once meant as devotion, became torment. His legacy, once imagined as sanctity, became horror. So when we speak of him today, we do not remember him for the prayers he recited or the sermons he preached. We remember him for the fear he created, for the cruelty he justified, and for the scars he left behind. His legacy is horrific not because he failed in his vows, but because he succeeded in corrupting them. He did not abandon faith, he weaponized it. And in doing so, he left behind a lesson carved into history itself, that the greatest horrors are not always found on battlefields or in courts, but within the walls of sanctuaries, when faith is transformed into a mask for madness. Faith is meant to be a light in the darkness, a sanctuary for weary souls seeking peace and redemption. Yet history shows us that even the holiest institutions are not immune to corruption. Even the most devout figures can become monsters when obsession consumes them. The monk who twisted vows of purity into weapons of domination left behind no miracles, no blessings, and no sanctity. What he left was fear, scars, and a legacy so drenched in horror that his story survives not as inspiration, but as a warning etched into the chronicles of time. When we trace his path from the beginning, we see the same pattern repeated again and again. His holy vows meant to bind him to humility, instead became masks to conceal his arrogance. His rituals, intended as devotion, became twisted ceremonies of torment, where prayer and pain were indistinguishable. The cloister he ruled ceased to be a place of brotherhood and transformed into a kingdom of fear, where silence was enforced not by peace but by terror. His punishments were not corrections, but spectacles of cruelty, designed to break bodies and spirits alike. And around all of it was woven a suffocating web of silence and betrayal, ensuring that the truth remained hidden, while his power remained absolute. The horrific legacy of this monk is not only in the individual lives he broke, but in the way his influence spread. His methods became examples for others who saw fear as a tool of devotion. His cruelty proved how easily the sacred could be corrupted when cloaked in piety. And his survival for so long, despite whispers of horror, revealed how institutions often protect power rather than truth. This is why his story matters, because it is not just about one man's madness, but about how easily madness can be sanctified, when no one dares to question it. The most chilling truth is how thoroughly he blurred the line between holiness and horror. To the outside world, he appeared as a man of unshakable faith, lean from fasting, zealous in preaching, tireless in ritual. Behind those stone walls, he turned discipline into domination, rituals into ordeals, and brotherhood into suspicion. His followers were not uplifted by his example. They were crushed beneath it. And yet he thrived, protected by the very system that should have condemned him. What makes his story endure is not just the cruelty itself, but the silence that surrounded it. Silence from those too afraid to resist. Silence from those too broken to speak. Silence from authorities who mistook brutality for zeal. This silence allowed his reign to endure, and long after his death, it allowed his legend to fester. Today, we may never know the full truth of his deeds, but the fragments that remain are enough to chill the blood. They tell us that horror does not always wear the face of the tyrant. Sometimes it wears the robes of a monk. His legacy stands as a dark mirror to faith itself. It shows us that devotion without mercy becomes fanaticism. Discipline without compassion becomes tyranny. Obedience without conscience becomes slavery. The vows he once made, chastity, obedience, humility, should have sanctified his life, but instead they were twisted into weapons that enslaved others. He did not fail his vows. He corrupted them, bending them to his obsession with control. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy not of salvation, but of damnation. The ruins of his cloister, long abandoned, became symbols of his memory. Pilgrims who once traveled there for inspiration began to speak of unease, of a heaviness that clung to the air. Locals whispered of cries at night, of shadows lingering in halls that should have been silent. Historians debate where fact ends and legend begins, but even legend itself is a testament to the impact he left. The fact that centuries later people still speak of him is proof of the depth of his horror. Yet even in his darkness, there lies a lesson, perhaps the most important of all. His story is not just about cruelty, it is about vigilance. It warns us that no institution, no leader, no vow is beyond corruption. Faith can heal, but it can also be twisted. Ritual can uplift, but it can also enslave. Silence can preserve peace, but it can also preserve horror. And when these forces combine in the wrong hands, they create not saints, but monsters who cloak themselves in holiness while feasting on fear. The conclusion of his story is not redemption, but exposure. His name survives not in glory, but in infamy. His monastery does not stand as a monument of faith, but as a ghost of terror. Legacy is not one of miracles, but of scars. Scars on the bodies and souls of those he ruled. And scars on the history of faith itself. He's remembered because he shows us the dangers of devotion without love, of power without restraint, and of silence without truth. So when we remember the monk who turned faith into horror, we are not simply retelling a tale of medieval cruelty. We are confronting a truth that echoes across time, that the greatest horrors often hide in plain sight, disguised as virtue. His story lingers because it is not bound to one cloister, one century, or one man. It is a universal warning, a reminder of the thin line between devotion and destruction, between holiness and horror. And perhaps that is why his legacy endures, because it forces us to ask difficult questions. Who do we trust when power cloaks itself in virtue? How do we discern true faith from fanaticism? And how do we ensure that silence never again becomes the accomplice of horror? These questions are the real inheritance of his story. Questions that remain as urgent today as they were in the shadows of his monastery. In the end, the monk who turned faith into horror is remembered not for the prayers he recited or the rituals he performed. He is remembered for the fear he spread, the cruelty he sanctified, and the darkness he left behind. His legacy is not a beacon, but a warning, that when faith is stripped of mercy, it becomes indistinguishable from tyranny.
History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.